Some places were never meant to be disturbed. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Tonight we take you to the cold, lifeless halls of Black Ridge City Morgue, a place where the dead should sleep peacefully, but don't. When the clock strikes midnight, the air grows thick with something unseen, something unnatural. What if the dead weren't just bodies lying still? What if they were watching, waiting, and ready to rise? Would you dare to spend a night in a morgue if someone paid you? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more terrifying tales, because this one is just getting started. Are you ready? The wind howled through the narrow alleys of Black Ridge City as storm clouds loomed over the skyline. The air was damp, thick with the scent of rain-soaked concrete. A lone figure moved swiftly through the shadows, pulling his coat tighter around his body. Ethan Graves had been the night attendant at Black Ridge City Morgue for nearly 2 years, and in all that time, he had never felt the kind of unease that gnawed at his gut tonight. Maybe it was the way the storm rattled the windows, or how the power had flickered twice before he even stepped inside. But there was something else, something deeper, that whispered a warning in the back of his mind. Shaking it off, he swiped his ID card and pushed open the heavy metal doors. The morgue greeted him with its usual sterile chill, the fluorescent lights casting an artificial glow over the white-tiled floors. Rows of steel storage compartments lined the walls, each containing a silent occupant, waiting for an autopsy or identification. Ethan sighed, setting his coffee on the desk. Just another night, he muttered, convincing himself that everything was normal. As he moved through the morgue, he did his usual rounds. There were 5 bodies tonight, each tagged and accounted for. The newest arrival, a John Doe, had been brought in just before his shift. No ID, no belongings, just a body with deep, jagged wounds across his chest, as if something had torn through him. Ethan frowned. "Damn," he whispered. "What the hell did this guy go through?" He reached for his clipboard, but as he did, the lights flickered again. A low hum filled the room, an unnatural vibration that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The air grew thick, suffocatingly heavy, and the temperature plummeted. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate click. It came from one of the storage compartments. Ethan froze, his breath hitching. He turned his head, eyes locking onto the wall of locked chambers. Another click, and then the metal handle of one of the compartments twitched. He swallowed hard. The rational part of his brain screamed that it was just a malfunction, a trick of his exhausted mind. But another sound followed, a deep, dragging scrape, as if something inside was shifting. Then the door burst open. A body tumbled out, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. The corpse lay motionless, its white sheet clinging to its form. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Graves." Before he could finish, the sheet moved. Ethan's blood turned to ice as the body twitched violently, fingers curling, limbs spasming. And then, with a guttural gasp, it sat up. The dead man's eyes shot open, milky white, clouded with death, yet somehow filled with something more. Something wrong. Ethan stumbled back, knocking over a tray of surgical tools. The clatter echoed through the room, but the thing in front of him barely reacted. It tilted its head, a slow, unnatural movement, and fixed its hollow gaze on him. "Jesus Christ," Ethan whispered. The corpse opened its mouth, but no words came out, only a dry, wheezing rasp. Then with unnatural speed, it lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. He dove to the side as the dead man's stiff fingers clawed at the space where he had just stood. The morgue was filled with the sound of heavy, ragged breathing, his own, and the horrifying wheezing from the thing that shouldn't be moving. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and swung it with all his might. The impact sent the corpse staggering back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it laughed, a garbled, wet sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Then came another sound, a sharp clang from behind him. Ethan turned just in time to see another storage compartment, handle twisting, then another, and another. One by one, the locked compartments began to open. The sound of metal screeching against metal filled the air as the doors were pushed outward from the inside. Ethan's heart pounded as more bodies fell to the floor, each one convulsing, each one awakening. The morgue was no longer a resting place. It was a hunting ground. Ethan bolted for the door, his boots slipping against the cold tiles as he sprinted. But as his fingers wrapped around the handle, something slammed into him from behind, sending him crashing to the ground. He rolled onto his back, chest heaving, as the first corpse loomed over him. Its lips curled into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth blackened with decay. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's scream never made it past his throat. Ethan's body was frozen with terror. The corpse crouched over him, its breath reeking of decay. Its lips twisted into an unnatural grin, exposing teeth that looked sharpened, jagged, as if they had been gnawed down by something inhuman. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped again, its voice layered, as though more than one voice spoke at once. Ethan snapped out of his shock, his survival instincts kicking in. With a surge of adrenaline, he shoved the corpse back, sending it staggering across the floor. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse hammering as his eyes darted around the morgue. The storage compartments, each and every one of them, were now open, and the bodies were moving. Some twitched and jerked, struggling to find their footing. Others dragged themselves across the floor, their brittle bones cracking with each motion. A woman's corpse slumped against the examination table, her lifeless eyes rolling back into place as her head jerked unnaturally to one side. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the cold, slick tiles. He needed to get out. Now his eyes locked onto the emergency exit at the far end of the room. His feet moved before he could think, sprinting toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, a bony hand shot out from behind him, clawing into his shoulder. A searing pain ripped through him as he was yanked backward. He crashed against the floor, the breath knocked from his lungs. Above him, the corpse that had spoken loomed once more, its pale, peeling face twisted into something beyond human. Its fingers dug deeper into his flesh, dark veins pulsating beneath its skin. "Why? Are you here?" it hissed. Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain, his mind racing. He did the only thing he could think of. He fought. With a violent twist, he kicked his knee into the creature's chest, sending it toppling backward. It hit the examination table, knocking over a tray of scalpels. Without hesitation, Ethan lunged forward and grabbed the largest scalpel he could find. The corpse lunged again, its skeletal fingers reaching for him. Ethan didn't think. He acted. With a guttural cry, he drove the scalpel into the creature's eye socket. A shriek tore through the morgue, shrill and unnatural, as blackened blood gushed from the wound. The thing writhed, its limbs convulsing violently before finally collapsing in a lifeless heap. Ethan stumbled back, panting, his hands slick with sweat and gore. He didn't have time to celebrate, because the others were watching. The room was silent. Then the whispering started. It slithered through the air like a sinister breeze coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Low, hissing voices, speaking in tongues Ethan couldn't understand. The sound grew louder, layered, echoing off the morgue's cold walls. Ethan's fingers tightened around the scalpel, his breath shallow. The corpses were standing now. All of them. Their vacant eyes locked onto him, their lips moving without sound. The whispering swelled, suffocating in its intensity. The walls seemed to tremble, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly above them. Then, as if responding to some silent command, they moved. Ethan turned and bolted. He hit the emergency exit at full force, shoving it open. Cold night air rushed over him, but he didn't stop. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted down the alleyway behind the morgue, his lungs burning. He risked a glance over his shoulder and nearly tripped over his own feet. They were following, not running, not stumbling, gliding. Their feet barely touched the ground, their forms distorted, shifting in and out of the shadows like specters. Their faces remained frozen in grim, lifeless expressions, their lips still moving, still whispering. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs as he turned a sharp corner, heading for the nearest street. But as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the world around him shifted. The streetlights flickered and died. The air grew thick, pressing against his chest. The city, Blackridge itself, had gone silent. No cars, no voices, nothing. Panic clawed at his throat. He spun around, searching for any sign of life. But the city was wrong. The buildings seemed taller, their windows pitch black. The pavement beneath him felt softer, like stepping on damp earth instead of concrete. Then the whispering returned, right behind him. Ethan turned slowly. The corpses stood just feet away, unmoving, watching. The lead corpse, the one he had stabbed, twitched its head, the scalpel still embedded in its ruined eye. It smiled. "Welcome home." Ethan's scream was swallowed by the darkness. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind refusing to comprehend what he was seeing. The city had changed. The streets, once familiar, now stretched unnaturally into the darkness, twisting like veins beneath a dying skin. The buildings loomed, their facades cracked and crumbling, windows nothing more than hollow black pits. And the corpses, they were still watching him. His breath hitched. He needed to run, to escape whatever nightmare had swallowed Blackridge whole. But his legs wouldn't move. The whispering continued, seeping into his skull like thick smoke. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was inside him. They were inside him. Ethan gritted his teeth, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real." Then the lead corpse, the one with the scalpel lodged in its eye, took a single step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. The others followed, gliding noiselessly over the distorted pavement, their lips still whispering. The sound grew unbearable, voices overlapping, growing into a chaotic, deafening storm. Words Ethan couldn't understand, words that didn't belong to the living. And then they screamed. All at once, their faces twisted into expressions of pure agony. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, skin splitting at the corners, teeth rotting before his eyes. Their hollow sockets burned with unnatural fire, black veins spidering beneath their peeling flesh. And they charged. Ethan snapped out of his paralysis, adrenaline flooding his veins. He turned and ran, sprinting down the unnatural street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The city was shifting around him, buildings bending and twisting, doors appearing and disappearing. His boots pounded against the warped ground, each step threatening to sink into the abyss below. Behind him, the dead gave chase. Their screams echoed, a high-pitched wail that sent ice down his spine. He could hear them gaining, their unnatural speed defying physics, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows. Sharp turn. He dove into a narrow alley, his shoulder slamming against a wall. He stumbled but forced himself forward, dodging overturned dumpsters and rusted pipes. The end of the alley was close. So close. Slam! A wall. Ethan skidded to a stop, his palms slamming against the brick. He spun around. The corpses stood at the entrance of the alley, completely still. Watching, then the lead corpse smiled again. "You belong to us now." Ethan's pulse thundered as the walls of the alley shifted. The bricks rippled like liquid, bleeding darkness that slithered toward him, crawling up his legs like ink-soaked tendrils. He thrashed, trying to break free, but the shadows only tightened their grip. The corpses remained motionless, their empty eyes locked onto him. The lead corpse took another step forward. "You can't fight it," it whispered, its voice layered with thousands of others. "You can't fight it," it whispered, its voice layered with thousands of others. "You were always meant to return." Ethan's mind reeled. Return? What the hell did it mean? The shadows climbed higher, wrapping around his arms, his chest, pulling him down. The world blurred, the air thickening until it became impossible to breathe. His lungs burned, his body trembled. And then, darkness. Silence. Ethan's vision snapped back into focus. He was no longer in the alley. The morgue surrounded him once again. But it was different. The examination tables were covered in thick layers of dust, the overhead lights flickering dimly. The air smelled of decay, of rot that had seeped into the very walls. The storage compartments, those cold steel chambers, were still open. But now they were empty. The morgue was abandoned. Ethan turned in a slow circle, his breath shallow. "What the hell?" Then a voice, a soft, rasping whisper. He whipped around. A figure stood in the far corner of the room. A woman. Her body was frail, her hospital gown tattered. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her veins blackened like ink had been injected into them. She took a slow step forward. "Ethan," she whispered. His stomach twisted. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head. "You don't remember, do you?" A cold sweat broke across his skin. "Remember what?" The lights flickered again. For a brief second, the morgue shifted. The walls cracked, the ceiling peeled, the air thickened with shadows. And in that instant, Ethan saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them. Their hollow eyes locked onto him, their lips moving in silent whispers. The woman took another step, and the world snapped back to normal. "You were never meant to leave," she murmured. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What does that mean? Who are you?" She took one final step, her face inches from his. And then she smiled. "You were one of us." The room collapsed. Ethan fell to his knees, his head splitting open with pain. His mind remembered. The morgue. The bodies. The truth. He wasn't supposed to be alive, because Ethan Graves had died a long time ago. Ethan gasped, clutching his skull as jagged memories surged through his mind like broken glass. Images flickered, blood-slicked floors, a cold metal table, the distant echo of a flatline. No. No, that's not possible. His breath came in ragged bursts, his body shaking. He was alive. He could feel his own heartbeat, the sweat dripping down his skin. But the woman, her whisper, her smile. "You were one of us," she had said. Ethan forced himself to his feet, staggering back. His fingers twitched, his entire body rejecting the thought that clawed at his consciousness. "I'm not dead," he growled, shaking his head. The woman tilted her head, her pupils dilating into endless voids. "Then why are you still here?" The lights overhead buzzed violently. The walls trembled as if something massive shifted behind them. The temperature plummeted, an icy breath slithering through the room. Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He turned sharply, searching for an escape, but the morgue had changed again. The door he had come through was gone, replaced by an expanse of darkness that seemed to breathe. And then, the whispering returned. It slithered from the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. The shadows deepened, and from them, they emerged. The corpses, but not just the ones from the storage compartments. Hundreds. Some rotting, their flesh sagging from brittle bone. Others eerily intact, their glassy eyes unblinking. All of them moved with a sinister grace, their feet never quite touching the ground. The woman's lips curled. "You don't remember how you died, do you?" Ethan's throat tightened. His mind refused to accept it. "I didn't die," he rasped. The corpses drew closer. Their lips moved, but no words escaped. Only the terrible overlapping whispering that filled the room with its suffocating weight. Then, a single voice cut through the noise. "Ethan!" He froze. It was familiar. Too familiar. A cold hand gripped his wrist. He spun around, and his breath stopped. His reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't a reflection in a mirror. It was him. A second Ethan stood there, identical in every way, except for the gaping, jagged wound slashed across his chest. Blood soaked through the fabric of his morgue uniform, his lips tinged blue, his skin pallid. "You never left," the other Ethan whispered, his eyes dark and hollow. "You've been here all along." Ethan staggered backward, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real." The corpses shuddered, their whispering turning to distorted laughter. The woman's form flickered, her face shifting, her skin stretching like it wasn't hers to begin with. The dead Ethan stepped forward. "You think you're still alive, don't you?" "I am alive," Ethan snarled. His double smiled, a slow, eerie grin. "Then why can you see us?" Ethan's chest tightened. Before he could finish, the world collapsed. The floor beneath him cracked open, and darkness swallowed him whole. Falling, endless, suffocating freefall. The whispering voices screeched, turning to unholy screams. And then, silence. Ethan hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. He groaned, rolling onto his back, his vision blurred before snapping into focus. He was no longer in the morgue. He lay in the middle of a vast, endless graveyard. Rows upon rows of tombstones stretched into the darkness, their surfaces cracked and worn. A dense fog curled between them, snaking along the ground like living tendrils. The sky was void of stars, swallowed by an abyssal blackness. The only sound was the distant creaking of a rusted gate, swinging in the unseen wind. Ethan struggled to his feet, his limbs heavy. His heart pounded as he took in the gravestones, his fingers tracing over the nearest one. The name was worn away, unreadable. But as he moved to the next, his breath caught. Ethan Graves' his own name, carved into stone. The date of death was unreadable, but it didn't matter. It was his grave. Ethan staggered back, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Number, no, this isn't!" A hand shot out of the dirt, a pale, rotting hand. Then another, and another. The graves around him opened. Bodies clawed their way out, their empty sockets glowing with unnatural fire. Their twisted limbs snapped as they rose, their lips peeling back in grotesque smiles. And then one of them spoke. "You were never meant to wake up." Ethan's scream echoed through the endless graveyard. Ethan's scream ripped through the silent graveyard. But the sound was swallowed by the abyss above. The corpses crawled from the graves, their decayed fingers clawing through the damp earth. Their bodies jerked unnaturally, as if their bones resisted the motion, but still they rose. And they were all looking at him. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't layered. It was unified. A single voice. "Join us!" Ethan's pulse pounded in his skull. His feet stumbled backward as the dead advanced, their mouths twisted into sick, knowing grins. His own tombstone loomed behind him like a cruel monument, a chilling reminder of something his mind refused to accept. "I'm not one of you," he shouted, his voice raw. A corpse stepped forward, its jaw dangled by thin strands of decayed flesh, its eye sockets hollow and bottomless. But despite the ruin of its face, Ethan knew it. His best friend. Marcus. Ethan's breath hitched. "Number, no. This isn't possible. You died years ago." Marcus tilted his head, a grotesque crack echoing through the air. "And yet, here I am." His voice was layered, unnatural, as if something else spoke through him. Ethan's stomach twisted. Marcus had died in a car crash. Ethan had attended the funeral. He had seen the coffin lowered into the earth, and now he stood here, with the rest of the dead. The corpses moved closer, the air thick with the stench of rot. The fog coiled around Ethan's ankles like hungry fingers. The graveyard pulsed with something wrong, something ancient. "I need to get out of here." Ethan's muscles tensed. He spun on his heel and ran. His boots pounded against the damp soil, his breath ragged. The graveyard stretched endlessly, the tombstones shifting as if the land itself moved to keep him trapped. Behind him, the dead pursued. But they didn't run. They glided. Their feet never touched the earth, their forms flickering in and out of reality like distorted shadows. The whispering grew louder, wrapping around his mind, weaving into his thoughts. Ethan's vision blurred. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. And then, the ground disappeared. He fell. Down, down, down. The graveyard above shrank into nothing, and darkness consumed him. Then, impact. Ethan hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. The sensation of falling vanished, replaced by the cold, sterile scent of antiseptic and something familiar. He groaned, rolling onto his back, his fingers brushing against smooth tile. His vision refocused. Fluorescent lights flickered above him. White walls, stainless steel tables, the hum of industrial refrigeration units, the morgue. Ethan's body seized with panic. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. The examination tables stood empty. The storage compartments were shut. Had it all been a nightmare? Something was wrong. The room was too quiet. The air was thick, stagnant. The lights overhead pulsed, casting unnatural shadows along the walls. And then, a slow click. the sound of a storage compartment unlocking. Ethan's blood turned to ice. His eyes darted to the far end of the room. One of the cold chamber doors was opening. His stomach clenched. Don't look, but his body betrayed him. The metal door swung outward with a groan, and something inside shifted. A body. His body. Ethan's breath hitched. There, lying on the slab, was him. His own lifeless form, skin pale, lips tinged with the unmistakable blue of death. His chest was still, unmoving. His eyes, half open, stared into nothing. Ethan staggered backward. No! No, this isn't real! A voice whispered behind him. It is! He spun around. The woman from before stood inches away. Only now she was different. Her flesh was peeling, her eyes swirling with darkness. Her mouth stretched into a too-wide grin, her teeth wrong. You've been dead all along, Ethan, she whispered. You just forgot. Ethan's entire body trembled. His mind rebelled against the words. No, I woke up. I fought. I ran. But then, the truth hit him. The crash. The blood. The moment the world had gone dark. He had never escaped the morgue, because he had never left in the first place. The whispering grew deafening, the walls shaking as the corpses emerged once more, their hollow eyes glowing. The woman's form shifted, her flesh twisting, revealing something else underneath. Something ancient, something hungry. Ethan's knees buckled, his vision blurred. The morgue walls melted into darkness, and the last thing he saw was himself, lying cold, motionless, dead. Ethan's body convulsed as the truth settled in like a slow-acting poison. He wanted to deny it, to scream that this was some elaborate trick, but the weight of reality crushed him. He had been dead all along. The whispering turned into a deafening chorus, the morgue walls twisting like something alive. The corpses surrounding him shuddered, their bodies contorting unnaturally as their grins widened too much. The woman, if she could still be called that, loomed closer, her skin peeling away in ribbons, revealing a darkness beneath. You were never supposed to wake up, she purred, her voice a sick melody in his ears. Ethan stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. He turned to run, but his own corpse grabbed his ankle. A jolt of pure terror shot through him as he looked down. His lifeless body, his body, was staring at him, its cold fingers tightening like a vice. The sensation sent a pulse of ice through his veins, and when he tried to wrench free, the grip only tightened. You can't leave, his corpse rasped, its lips barely moving. Ethan's heart pounded as he kicked violently, finally breaking free. He scrambled backward, sweat dripping down his spine despite the frigid air. The corpses, the woman, his own body, they were all closing in. No, I won't stay here. His mind screamed for an escape. Then he saw it, a door. At the far end of the morgue, barely visible through the shifting shadows, stood a rusted metal door. It hadn't been there before, but Ethan didn't care. It was a way out. He bolted, his feet pounded against the cold tiles as he sprinted toward salvation. The corpses shrieked in protest, their whispers turning to ear-piercing howls. The walls cracked, black liquid seeping through, the morgue itself fighting to keep him trapped. But Ethan didn't stop. He reached the door, gripping the rusted handle with both hands. It burned against his skin, as if the metal itself rejected his touch. Behind him, the corpses charged. Ethan threw his weight against the door. It wouldn't budge. A low, guttural laugh echoed behind him. You can't escape the dead, the woman whispered, because you are one of them. Ethan let out a strangled cry as something cold wrapped around his neck. The corpse's hands clawed at him, yanking him backward. Their grips were unrelenting, their fingers sinking into his skin. The door was slipping away, his last chance slipping away. But then, a voice. Wake up! The world shattered. A force unlike anything Ethan had ever felt tore through the morgue, blasting the corpses backward. The woman screamed, her form flickering between flesh and shadow, her features warping into something inhuman. The door burst open. A blinding light swallowed everything. Ethan was falling, spinning, plummeting through an endless void. The whispers faded. The corpses vanished. And then, darkness, stillness, silence. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was lying on his back, gasping for breath. His lungs burned, his heart hammering like it had been shocked back to life. Blinking rapidly, he tried to take in his surroundings. White walls, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a hospital room. He wasn't in the morgue. He wasn't in the graveyard. He was alive. A sudden gasp made him turn his head. A woman, nurse maybe, stood frozen at the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to wake up." Ethan's blood ran cold. His nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as the nurse stood frozen in the doorway, her face drained of color. The words echoed in his head like a death sentence. "You weren't supposed to wake up." His throat tightened. "What did you just say?" The nurse took a hesitant step backward. Her lips trembled as if she had spoken without meaning to, like the words had slipped out. She swallowed hard. "I need to get the doctor." She turned sharply, bolting from the room before he could stop her. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving him alone with nothing but the steady beep of the heart monitor and the sterile white walls pressing in around him. Ethan struggled to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. His body felt weak, like it had been out of use for too long. He tugged at the wires attached to his chest, watching as the monitor flickered erratically. Something was wrong. He could still feel it. That creeping sensation, like something unseen was still watching, waiting just beyond the veil of reality. Then, a flicker. The fluorescent light above him buzzed, dimming for half a second before returning to its cold, sterile glow. Then another flicker. The room shuddered. Ethan's breath hitched. The air grew dense, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor turned erratic, distorting into something inhuman. Then, the whispers returned. Low at first, like distant murmurs seeping through the walls. Then they grew louder, rising in pitch, overlapping into a sickening chorus. He woke up. He's not supposed to be here. Take him back. Ethan clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the hospital bed. His fingers dug into the sheets, his knuckles turning white. "No," he hissed. "I made it out. I escaped." The whispers laughed. The lights above him burst, sending shards of glass raining down. The heart monitor flatlined. The air became thick with the scent of decay. Then, the door opened. Ethan's body stiffened. The hallway beyond the door was wrong. It wasn't the brightly lit corridor of a hospital. It was dark, endless. The walls pulsed like living flesh, shadows slithering along the floor like ink spreading in water. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, unmoving, featureless, except for its eyes. Two hollow pits of darkness, deeper than the void itself. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew that figure. It had been there in the morgue, in the graveyard, in the whispers. It had been waiting. "You never left," the figure said, its voice a deep, guttural echo. "You only delayed the inevitable." Ethan's body screamed at him to move, to fight, to run. But his limbs felt heavy. The darkness crept toward him, tendrils slithering across the floor, reaching for his ankles. The shadows wrapped around the hospital bed, pulling it downward like it was sinking into something unseen. Ethan gritted his teeth. Number. He refused to go back. With a burst of strength, he lunged off the bed, yanking the IV from his arm. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself forward, stumbling toward the only other exit, the window. He didn't know how high up he was. He didn't care. The alternative was worse. Behind him, the figure stepped forward. The entire room tilted, reality warping as if the world itself was breaking apart. "Come back," the figure whispered. Ethan jumped. Glass shattered around him as he plummeted into the abyss below. The wind howled in his ears, his heart hammering against his ribs. The city skyline rushed toward him, neon lights blurring together in a chaotic haze. Then, a hand shot out of the darkness beneath him. Cold, unforgiving. It grabbed his wrist. Ethan screamed as he was yanked downward, pulled into a void deeper than night itself. The city disappeared. Reality disappeared. There was only darkness and the whispers. Take him back. Ethan's scream was swallowed by the void as he was dragged down, the hand around his wrist burning like ice. The darkness wasn't just emptiness. It was alive, coiling around him, tightening like a suffocating grip. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, voices clawing at his mind, ripping into his thoughts. Take him back. He doesn't belong here. He never left. Ethan struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was useless. The pull was relentless, dragging him deeper into the abyss. Then, a flash of light, blinding, searing. A force shoved him backward, breaking the grip on his wrist. Ethan tumbled through the void, his body twisting in free fall, until he hit the ground. Hard, air rushed back into his lungs. His vision blurred, his head spinning as he forced himself to his knees. He was no longer in the abyss, no longer in the hospital, no longer anywhere he recognized. The world around him was shifting. Walls flickered between cold morgue tiles and endless graveyard mist. 1 second, he was standing before a row of gleaming autopsy tables. The next, tombstones stretched in every direction. And then, the figure returned. It stood motionless a few feet away, its hollow eyes drilling into him. But this time, Ethan saw more. Behind the figure, hundreds of shadowy forms lurked. Some were twisted, grotesque, their bodies riddled with decay. Others were faceless, flickering between human and something else. All of them were trapped, and Ethan understood. This wasn't just about him. This place, a limbo between the living and the dead, was full of souls who had been stolen, lost, forgotten. The morgue at midnight wasn't just where the dead refused to rest. It was where they were kept prisoner. The figure stepped closer. "You are ours!" Ethan clenched his fists. "No!" A low chuckle rumbled through the air. "You think you have a choice?" The shadows lunged. Ethan ran. He darted through shifting hallways, vaulting over tombstones that hadn't been there seconds before. The ground cracked beneath him, threatening to swallow him whole. The voices screamed. The walls shrank. The morgue, the graveyard, the void. It was all collapsing. He had to find a way out. Then, a door appeared ahead. Rusty, flickering, a single word carved into the metal. "Exit." Ethan didn't hesitate. He slammed into the door, yanking it open. A force ripped through him. The screams behind him faded. The shadows howled. And then, silence. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was on the cold morgue floor, gasping for breath. The heart monitor beside him beeped steadily. The fluorescent lights above flickered. But this time, they didn't burst. He was back, truly back. The morgue was silent. The cold air pressed against his skin, but the oppressive presence was gone. Ethan's chest heaved. He touched his wrist, where the shadowy hand had grabbed him. A bruise remained, a reminder. He had been there, and he wasn't supposed to return. Slowly, he pushed himself up. The room remained still, empty. But he knew the truth. The dead weren't resting, not really, and neither was he. Because once you see what lies beyond the veil, it never stops watching you. The end. That's it. The final generation of the morgue at midnight. When the dead refused to rest. What did you think of the story? Did the ending surprise you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more chilling stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because the horror is only just beginning. Would you dare to step into the morgue at midnight? Or do you think something would be waiting for you? Let's talk about it below. If you are new to our channel, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next video.